species in lakes and rivers and trees that can't speak for themselves, can't act for themselves. Next slide. Now, you might wonder who is struggling on the other side in our so-called democracy to have laws passed that we all supposedly should have some input to. How many of you are familiar with the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEX for short? Okay, a few of you. Last year, 800 bills were passed or were introduced in state legislatures across the United States, many in New York State, some of them affiliated with the gas industry, that were pushed by a combination of people meeting in back rooms, corporate attorneys, corporate lobbyists, and the industries that they represented, and our elected officials that have been members of ALEX. Now, those laws came out of those meetings and were introduced in our state legislatures without any of us in this room being privy to, one, the formulation of those bills, or two, unless we were paying rapt attention to our legislative process, that those were bypassing the democratic process. 20% of those bills were passed. Now, you may also be familiar that recently ALEX has come under extreme criticism. Several of those people that were signatures to ALEX as members, Pepsi-Cola, Walmart, and I believe some of the energy companies as well, have withdrawn their membership because it became obvious to the people of the United States that we had this kind of non-democratic process going on right in front of our noses. Next slide. So this is a quote from their website. I'd like to read this because this is the way the big lies are told. The American Legislative Exchange Council is the nation's largest nonpartisan individual membership organization of state legislators with more than 2,000 members across the nation. ALEX is committed to advancing the Jeffersonian principles of free markets, limited government, federalism, and individual liberty. ALEX is classified by the Internal Revenue Service as a 501c3 nonprofit public policy and educational organization. Individuals, philanthropic foundations, corporations, companies, or associations are eligible to support ALEX work through tax-deductible gifts. So we have the same level as a church masquerading as a Jeffersonian-based company. For those of you who are historians or history majors or are interested in history, you all know that nowhere in Jefferson's writing are we talking about free markets in the way that they're talking about free markets. An international world trade organization, free market relationship, and here we have ALEX masquerading under this big lie of being connected to one of our founding fathers. Next slide, please. Most of you can affiliate, I think, with this cartoon. It doesn't need to be a Republican that's in the pocket. It could just as well be a Democrat. And what is it? This comes out of Pennsylvania. John Cole is a noted cartoonist down in Pennsylvania that's done a lot of these cartoons around the fracking. And he's talking about how Frack Inc. has bought, in this case, the corporate legislature and the state governor, the ability to drill in state forests, the ability to drill on campuses, no severance tax, tax for natural gas fleets, all of these being purchased by campaign contributions. Anybody know what the other word for a campaign contribution is?
Right.
It's getting around. Okay, how did all of this begin? Let's go back in history a little bit. As the 19th century began, we had a constitution, the laws of which had been formulated overwhelmingly by a minority of people made up of rich, white males, excluding all people of color, all women, all Native Americans. No one bought them, and even the authority to vote was restricted to men, white men, property-owning men, not renting men. Next slide.
I just wonder if the projection could be elevated a bit.
Well, I can try
At the top
that.
of the screen, it's really hard to,
How's that?
that
Better.
might be better
That's a little
for
better.
folks. Thank you.
Okay, so the corporate class, which came into existence in 1886, but many laws had been pushed before then to allow corporations to be seen as persons under the law, there was a lot of resistance to this in this country. You had mass resistance, and what happened is we got transformed from a slave state into a corporate state. Some would say that there wasn't much difference. It was even more comprehensive in terms of the slavery under which we served, because the laws that were enculturated and constitutionalized, encoded in our Constitution, had been pressed by large corporate bodies, like the fracking industry. Fracking industry has so much power, which later on in my presentation I'll show you, had the ability to take laws that had been put in place to protect us and eviscerate them, to take them away. Next slide. So in a corporate state, what does that look like? Culture, contrived celebration, illegitimately clothed directors and executive officers of chartered, read incorporated businesses, in governing authority. In other words, they have the authority, and this is usurpation. It's a usurpation of taking away, removal of all of our rights. A corporate state nurtures, enables, and expedites such illegitimate governing authority by violence enforced by courts, jails, police, military force, and by historians, the ones that write the corporate history, less overtly ferocious institutions for profit and non-profit, organizations like NGOs that routinely reinforce that reality.
I know what an NGO is.
A non-governmental organization, for example, the Sierra Club, NRDC, Natural Defense Fund. Now this is a friend over at Dansville exercising his democratic right to go out in front of a DEC hearing. This was the first hearing on the S-Geis around New York State, over in Dansville, New York. There were 800 people, over 800 people in this auditorium. The vast majority of them, 80% was estimated, in opposition to fracking. So we'll get into how this democracy gets transformed into laws when we have this kind of usurpation that corporations have given us and brought us. So who are we to criminalize fracking? Us that are advocating for the criminalization of fracking. We're the people that don't want to be fracked, number one. Others are influenced by the corporate leaders. We feel disempowered by these laws that have been instituted, which assign the development of New York resources to the executive branch through the Department of Environmental Conservation. Now, how many people think that we have a democracy in New York State? Can I see a show of hands? Not one. Well, it's interesting that word has also gotten around, because we visited with Senator Avella, who also acknowledged that from his perspective, we don't have a democracy in New York State. We have a governor between legislative sessions that has come out and said that he has the authority, one man, with our elected representatives in the state of New York never having had an opportunity to decide on whether fracking should be instituted in the state, one man is assuming the responsibility and the authority to make the decision. Can anybody in this room tell me from whence the authority comes for the governor of New York State to be in a unilateral position to make this decision?
Elections.
Elections.
What's the basis of his claim?
That he has the authority to do this as the governor.
We elected him.
Where in the Constitution? Is anybody that's aware? I asked a state assemblyman in Utica the other day, can you tell me by what law the governor of the state of New York is authorized to make this decision unilaterally? He says, I can't, I don't know.
It's the same thing with town boards. Five people making a decision, not asking anybody.
Same thing with Obama.
Well, five people would be even better in this situation than one governor, I think.
I think so.
Yeah. Well, I'm not certain of that, but, so, we see it differently. If they won't, we will, we can, and we've written a draft bill to criminalize fracking. And I should say recriminalize, because I'll get to that point later on, next reason. Now, this is something that's going on across the East Coast. It's being, and I'm sorry this is cut off, but what essentially this says down here, if you frack New York, the growing nationwide movement to stop fracking will stop you at the polls in 2016. And that is, I mean, that's getting to the heart of it, isn't it? This man obviously has the ambition to run for president, and so these large NGOs have gotten together and actually are sending this across the East Coast, saying to the rest of the East Coast that outside of New York State, we want you to be of an understanding of what's going on in New York right now. Okay, we are taking this law, public law number 1, and taking it and putting it in the criminal code so that every district attorney, every local police force, every citizen that sees something that's connected to fracking can make a report to the judiciary to have this fracking discontinued. And I'll get into why we think it's criminal in the law. It's not about mitigating harms. It's not about how many parts per billion are we going to allow into our drinking water of some carcinogenic chemical. This is about saying no instead of saying no if, which my friend Spike will be getting into later on. The deliberate poisoning of people and the land is by any civilized standard a criminal act. If I were to come on to any person in this room's property, was to walk up to your well and drop the combination of 256 acknowledged chemicals that they use in fracking in New York, or they're going to use in New York, or hope to use in New York, in your well, what would happen to me?
Be arrested for terrorism.
You'd be breaking regulations and codes.
So I would be transported as an individual, and if you read the DEC enforcement portfolio, those things that are enforced against people in New York State, you will find that individuals most often get penalized worse than corporate bodies and businesses that have those same transgressions, even at a greater scale. Is that news to anybody here?
No.
Okay, so from our perspective, all of these accidents that are caused by corporations across the world, and here's a list of them down here, you're all familiar with Union Carbide, Bhopal, BP and Deepwater Horizon, Exxon Valdez, and the spill up in Alaska, or off the coast of the northwest U.S., and Dimock, Pennsylvania. The list goes on and on. It's continuous. I mean, you could add thousands of examples of corporate malfeasance upon us that haven't been adjudicated in a way that sends them to jail so that they don't do it again. I once took some time and a mind-numbing experience of writing away and getting the information of how many DEC infractions have been performed under the CAFO situation, where farms that were producing huge amounts of manure and spreading them out on the land and contaminating streams and waterways. And we followed the enforcement. They went out, it's called voluntary compliance. It means I'll go out and have a conversation with you, and I'll ask you not to do it again. Please don't do this again. It's not right for the environment, okay? Shake hands with me. So a couple months go by. Same farm, same infraction. I saw this repeated 3, 4, 5 times on these farms. It's the same thing you're going to see if this fracking comes into New York State. You're going to have non-disclosure agreements on anybody that's injured, just like in Pennsylvania it's occurring now. If you get injured, they either buy you off have you signed a non-disclosure agreement, or they come out and have that conversation, what's it gonna take for us to walk away and you not report this incident?
So we do we criminalize farming?
No, I don't think we did criminalize farming. I think
Okay,
we
thank you.
criminalize CAFOs that are
That's
huge
okay, that's all I
and
needed to know.
pollute our soil and our water.
Okay, thank
Those
you.
are the ones.
explain CAFOs.
Concentrated animal feeding operations. There are 500 animals or more in New York State, and in some instances, there's 7,000 animals concentrated on one farm, producing huge amounts of liquid manure that create alcohol and aldehydes and things that the soil fauna has never seen. I mean, that's what gets created in these big pits. Another topic, another time.
Kind of like Matt Ryan and the Binghamton Joint Huge Treatment.
Thanks. Okay, so what is the traditional way of limiting this kind of criminal behavior? It's to write a law, to criminalize it, and then to make those people that are responsible face a punishment that's commensurate with a crime. And getting to your point here, the terrorists must find a way to inject toxins and cancer agents into the underground water supply of major East Coast U.S. population centers, says someone amazingly looking like someone who's no longer among us. And on the other side, you have the Hydrofractured Gas Drilling Inc. going, ditto. Next slide. So after several years of studying this issue, attempting to work with all the appropriate agencies, going to all these meetings, protesting, large majorities of people in the communities that are represented, demanding that this not be done, that we want something introduced, a law that the people either vote up or down on so that we have a choice as to whether or not we're going to re-elect them because they cast that vote. We feel they must prevent this fracking. We're at the end of our line in terms of getting satisfaction from a system that we've been told all our lives exists. That we have democracy. That we have a way of exercising our rights that is represented by those people that we elect or re-elect.
Excuse me, they already took a vote in Binghamton and most major cities in New York. And it comes in the form of your NICEAG or your gas bill, and 68.5% of the population voted yes on natural gas.
Thank you for sharing that with me. Can we hold our questions and
Sure,
comments
sure.
until the
Yes,
end?
sir. Yes, sir.
Thank
No
you.
problem.
Okay, so what we've got is a feeling that we're no longer going to accept legislation that's aided and abets these corporate criminals. Their decisions are too often decided by and influenced by corporate propaganda, including the suppression of data on public health, which I talked about, non-disclosure agreements and consent agreements, greenhouse gas emissions, and negative economic productions for our communities. And many of you, I think, have seen a chart that compared the economies that you now live with within your communities and the economy if gas wells come in. And up in our area, up in the Finger Lakes area and in southern parts of the state, we see, like over a 20-year period, $292 billion coming into local economies with our current economy. The tourism, the wineries, the agriculture. In Yates County, where I come from, it has the largest mass dedicated to agriculture other than one other county out in California, in the Central Valley. Fracking is estimated to bring in between 16 billion to 20 billion, and those are old figures. Those were figures based on the projection of production that, if you've been reading the papers recently, has been severely reduced, as much as 50%. What's really driving this is a Ponzi scheme between Wall Street and the flipping of these leases. Next. So we're saying we move it out of the regulatory system, put it into the criminal system, into a code, codify it so that everybody in every community has an opportunity to look out their windows and see a portion of this infrastructure or this technology going on, report it to the local police, and to the district attorney for enforcement locally. What that does is it takes it out of the hands of an executive agency, the DEC, which is under the control of the governor. Now, agencies of the executive are convenient ways politically. Believe it or not, I once was a county politician. But it's like in county, you shove it off to a committee. And then the committee makes a recommendation back. And most of the county legislators, if they haven't gone to that committee meeting, accept the recommendation of that committee and vote positively. Executive agencies of the state of New York are a convenient way for the state legislature to take a politically hot issue and throw it into an agency, and then they wait for that recommendation back and for the executive to make the decision. That's probably where the governor gets his authority from, because he, in effect, almost owns that executive agency. It's part of his governance. Can you read this in the back, or shall I continue to read?
Did you read it? It's fine.
Okay, this is cancer. He's the new. I've always thought that cancer should be cancer, but he's the new DEP director down in Pennsylvania. He's saying, now, I can assure you that if indeed there was a large Marcellus class natural gas well being drilled in my office, it would say so right here on our DEP website. Well, what really happened was there were over 500 active wells that were not listed on the DEP website in Pennsylvania. In New York, there's 30,000 vertical wells drilled in the state that people don't have any concept of where they're located. We've got Swiss cheese, folks, all across the southern tier. In other words, if you push enough pressure geologically into this well that they propose to drill, you don't know where the hell that fluid's going. And you don't know by what viaduct it will be coming out of. So we're not made of green cheese, we're made of Swiss cheese, and the southern tier is a very prevalent part of those vertical wells and that Swiss cheese. Okay, so criminalization, and I'm going to go a little quicker here, but what that will eliminate is the need for all this multitude of statistical information, an S-Geist this thick that's going to tell you how they're going to mitigate the harmful effects of the technology that in every other state it's been in has not happened. It will punish the ancillary industry activities such as the massive water withdrawals, like the ones that are occurring in Painted Post right now, where they're taking over 1 million gallons a day down in Pennsylvania out of an aquifer that's already been drawn down and has a high total dissolved solids content to it that's above the EPA standard for drinking. And now they're taking more water out and drawing it down in that aquifer to take it down to Pennsylvania. Poisonous wastewater disposal and drill cuttings. The southern tier is already the recipient of a lot of these things. As you know, there's 4 landfills in the southern tier that are currently accepting these horizontal drilling waste and the moisture. And I always thought that it had to be 80% solids and 20% liquids. I was informed by Vince Spagnanelli that it's actually 80% liquid and 20% solids. So, you know what they do is they mix this with lime. They mix the liquid with lime and dump it in the truck along with the cuttings and bring it up to our landfills. 60% of the drillings are disposed of in Pennsylvania, 30% in New York right now, and 10% out in Ohio. Okay, it frees us from the shackles of having to beg. If we say we don't want this, we're saying no, we want legislation instituted that's going to remove this. We don't have to beg our regulators to come out and do the right thing in every community in which it takes place. Wouldn't that be a lot better than having that kind of having a civic responsibility, a culture of civic responsibility, where all of us are engaged in preventing something that is harmful for us? So this is sort of representative of what happens in a permitting agency. Permitting agencies are exactly that. They're established to permit. They're not established to say no. In 1963, when a DEC was established, it was a psychotic establishment, by the way, because on one side it says that we're going to be established to maximize the responsible withdrawal of natural resources in the state of New York. And on the other side, we're going to protect the environment. So you look at Texas, you think the state of Texas would have something very similar to that? Actually, the state of Texas has set it up so one of these is an agency that maximizes the resource recovery, and then they have a separate agency exclusively for the protection of the environment. I'm not saying it's working any better than Texas, but at least they don't have that schizophrenic establishment right from the start that you have a permitting agency that has to maximize the natural resources withdrawal. Okay, so this is a very simple narrative, and I've noted down here Richard Grossman. I want to recognize him because Richard Grossman was an historian on the program for democracy law and democracy corporation, program on corporations law and democracy, POCLAD, and then eventually moved into teaching democracy schools around the United States, which advocate for making our democracy real. Not an illusion, but real. Okay, this is the meat. This is where we go back, Columbia University, searching the web to find out what was the law before 2005, and what were those laws that were protecting us from this kind of toxic pollution. So Columbia Journal of Environmental Law in 2009, entitled A Graduated Punishment Approach to Environmental Crimes, says the goal of this paper is to examine and advocate for approaches to environmental crimes which go beyond punishing disobedience of administrative rules and decisions. Let me repeat that. Disobedience of administrative rules and decisions, because they have that now. They have this voluntary compliance. They have this ability to go out and sign a consent agreement with you or a non-disclosure agreement with you. When the government can prove that someone has both acted unlawfully and caused or threatened such harm, an effective system should have criminal sanctions in place to address the situation. So they went back and they looked at this, next slide. They looked at this, the laws that once gave us those criminal sanctions to fracking violators actually were in place. And this is the quote from that study. In the case of the United States, the examples will come mainly from the three major federal pollution standards, or statutes. Federal Water Pollution Control Act, or the Clean Water Act, here and after the CWA, and the Solid Waste Disposal Act, or Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, and the Clean Air Act. So let's look at those penalties. Before 2005, when Cheney and the oil and gas industry representatives and I think 2 or 3 non-governmental organizations, environmental organization executives were sitting in a room, these laws for knowing violations ran from 3 years to knowing endangerment of 15 years for toxins. For the dumping of toxins. Next slide. Resource RCRA Act was not quite as stringent. It ran from 2 to 5. And the Clean Air Act ran also up to 15 years for knowing endangerment of the worst kind. Now, the years represented are the maximum authorized incarceration. Fines are also. So I went back and started going through the EPA enforcement docket, which you can access on the internet as well. I wanted to find out how many of these corporations that under the laws prior to 2005, a national regulatory agency, okay, EPA, a executive agency at a higher level. So are they actually sending these felons off to prison in accordance with their law? In fact, every case that I could find, a fine was instituted. several, in some instances, again, like the state level, several times on the same company? Did they remove the charter of the corporation, which is allowed under current law of these corporations? No, never. Not once did I see that kind of removal. The only time I ever saw it come close was this guy, Alan Simpson. Anybody familiar with the name Alan Simpson down in Pennsylvania? Alan Simpson ran a business of waste disposal called Alan's Clean Water. I don't know, he had the glorified name for it. He was taking flowback water. He was taking grease from restaurants. And he was taking CAFO sewage sludge from POTWs. Mixing those all together in this toxic cocktail, spread it across 6 counties of Pennsylvania for 9 years before they caught him. He was instructing his truck drivers to drive his trucks into public drains and open the pitcock and just, you know, down the stream, or out into a field, or any stream that they could, at night, deliver this toxic mix to. Many feel that he was involved in that, that pollution of, what's the name of the stream where all the fish were killed?
Dunker.
Dunker. Yeah. So, they took him to court. He had 99 criminal violations. 99 criminal violations. They plea settled, plea bargained for down to 13. They fined him $250,000 and took the license to do this kind of business in the future away from he and his wife and sentenced him to some community service. It's estimated over the period of time that he was dumping this effluent across the 6 counties that he had made $7 million from doing that. Okay? That's the closest I've seen of any punishment, and now he and his wife have reapplied to go back into this business. It's pending in Pennsylvania. It's interesting to see what that state with this kind of egregious behavior will do. Next slide. All right, just a couple, I'm almost there to conclude this. These were all of the companies that were being evaluated by the EPA to take a look at their wells. You know, to test the wells that they had drilled. Only one company out of these 16 was selected, ConocoPhillips. Anybody have leases with ConocoPhillips here? I know of no leases in my area on ConocoPhillips, but that was the only company. Did they select? Did they select BP? Did they select Chevron? Did they any of the other big drillers? Yeah, none of these were selected. The 16 companies, however, that you see listed up there gave over $70 million in lobbying Congress. And this comes from a public citizen study in 2010. I've seen figures since then from Common Cause that $747 million was used in advertising, and $70 to $80 million additional to this was spent in lobbying our congressional representatives. Now that does not include some of the television time that has recently been, you've seen the proliferation as the resistance in New York State has grown. You might look at New York like the mouse that roared. And the industry has the trap out to catch that mouse that's roaring, because to have one example out there that's successful means that some of the other mice out in the hinterlands are going to start asking the question, why is this legitimized and why is it upon us? So we have a lot at stake in this state. If we are actually being looked at, not just by the other states, but we're being looked at around the world. Are we going to have the integrity as community after community in New York State to resist this kind of corporate poisoning, or aren't we? And what does that portend for our future generations not to mention the natural environment that many of us care so much about. Next slide. Okay, we've seen that public law number 1, this is what I hope that I transported to you today. We've discussed that public law number 1 can be seen as representing a recriminalization effort that will enable our state court system, not a regulatory agency, local, state, or national regulatory agency, to deal with fracking as a prohibited business practice. In fact, it will be a Class C felony with mandatory jail time. I've got copies of the law up here for anybody that would like them. I've got 30 copies, and I think somebody else brought some more. Both of which are included to penetrate the corporate shield. Are people familiar with what the corporate shield is, what that means? That's the liability, the lack of liability that a corporation will have if it does something wrong. That shields its executive directors and its board from a lawsuit of this nature, or a law of this nature.
And investors.
And investors too. So the law also requires that the state attorney general revoke a corporation's charter if the corporation is found guilty of a Class C felony. We need to start the revolution in this country. For those of you who are historians and like history, was based on getting rid of the British Empire's use of the Hudson Bay Corporation and the East India Corporation. The revolutionaries were opposed to having corporations with unlimited power that would not represent their interests. And what we effectively have in a governor that's saying that he will make that unilateral decision is we have taxation without representation. And let me explain to you why that is. If fracking comes into your community, your property values will decline. As your property values decline, the safety net, all of the other social services that your tax-paying dollars pay for now, it will increase because property valuations are what drives the taxes that are available to a county to provide those services. So guess who's going to pay for that? You think it's the corporations that have come in, taken the gas and gone back to Texas and Oklahoma, or shipped it over to Asia or Europe for 5 times what they can make here right now? So that's taxation without representation. It's time we start thinking as revolutionaries again. Next slide. Okay, this just happened 2 days ago down in Watkins Glen. This is actually someone I know being led away, and on the back of his t-shirt it says, "We're citizens and not subjects." The inference being that under the current structure of corporate state influence, we are subjects. We're enslaved to a corporate theocracy, or hypocrisy, not theocracy, hypocrisy. And he was arrested along with 2 other people down at the energy facility. Are you familiar with the energy facility? What they want to do is take all the wet gas coming out of the western parts of Pennsylvania, Ohio, and continue to drill in wet gas areas so that they can service their debt service. They don't have enough cash on hand because the price is down so low right now that they have to keep drilling. And of course, Exxon is out there drilling right along as fast as it can because it would like to see some of its competition evaporate. But anyway, this was down in Watkins Glen in Horseheads about 2.5 weeks ago. There was another action against Schlumberger or Schlumberger, and over in Watkins Glen there was a gathering of 250 people on the streets in that community opposed. I don't know if anybody here familiar with Watkins Glen. They're proposing on Route 14, one road comes into Watkins Glen, goes up the west side of Seneca Lake. One road. Can you imagine 1,000 trucks for one wellbore going through Watkins Glen? you know, the equivalent to what we have when we have the Italian-American festival down there, where they closed down the center part of that town, and traffic's backed all the way over to Montour Falls. 1,000 trucks would do the same thing, and that's one well. That's one well. How well thought out is this technology that they'll transport into our communities? Next. So, ending slide. New York Public Law, number 1, the felony offenses specified in the bill include extracting oil and gas via fracking in New York State, mapping, exploring, locating oil and gas deposits with the intent to frack, importing frack-related materials into the state, including fracking wastewater and drill cuttings, withdrawing any New York State water for the purpose of fracking anywhere, owning, possessing, or transporting fracking paraphernalia anywhere in New York State. Yes, that's a little different day. This includes the construction of fracking-related pipelines and compressors. And I think that's something an issue that's important, very much important in this area. These laws are available on the net, frackbustersnewyork.org and sovereignpeople.net. And Maura, did you bring some additional copies of the law?
I have
Okay, great. So
I got some too, Jeff.
okay, wonderful. So there's copies of the law that I hope people will take. In fact, I'll pass them around and people can take what they like.